Cesare Borgia, sometimes considered to be the main character of Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. Today we'll be going into a bit about his life, his exploits, and what made him, in many eyes, to be the perfect embodiment of the Renaissance prince. Now, to understand Cesare, we have to go back just a little bit. So, the Borgia family originally hailed from Iberia, in the then Kingdom of Valencia, which was a part of the crown lands of Aragon. They, like most family surnames, are derived from the area they hail from, in this case the town of Borja, with a J, which they later italicized into the well-known and more Italian Borgia. Their story really starts with Alphonse de Borgia, a scholar who resided at the University of Lleida, who later went on to become Pope Calixtus III. He reigned as head of the church for only 3 years before his death, but it was long enough for the Borgias to gain a foothold in Italy and set them up for further ventures. Here we have the crest of Borgia, the famous Borgia bull, which speaks to their Spanish origins. This was a point of pride for them, but it did cause a lot of resistance amongst the elder families of the consistory and the Italian elite. Now, the nephew of Calixtus, Rodrigo Borgia, is a pretty famous and powerful figure himself, going on to become Pope Alexander VI, a very powerful Renaissance pope who is responsible for things such as the Sistine Chapel and Michelangelo, a lot of the famous artists and artwork we get from this period, David statue even. Those are all commissioned from Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander. Now, Alexander had 4 children, the second of which is the subject of our video, Cesare. Now, to set the stage a bit more, let's talk about Italy during this period. Now, Italy during this period was a mess, really. Second only to the Holy Roman Empire in terms of the chaos of it. In the north, we have the powerful states of Milan and Venice. Now, Milan was a military power and condottieri stronghold, while Venice was one of the preeminent naval and economic powers of the world. In the center, we have a dozen free city-states and the Republic of Florence. Florence was a center of arts and learning that really helped to kick off both the Renaissance proper and, of course, the rise of the Medici banking dynasty. Right below Florence, we have the Papal States and the Romagna, which is the territory owned directly by the Pope. One can think of the Papal States as the Church's crown land, and the Romagna as territory governed by vassal lords. Almost the entirety of the boot of southern Italy and the large surrounding islands was composed of the Kingdom of Naples, a powerful and strategic territory that was frequently claimed and warred over by outside powers. To summarize, all these Italian nations were spiritual vassals of the Pope on paper, but they constantly schemed and waged war against each other, making for a very chaotic and uncertain borders, relations, and tensions. Cesare Borgia was born on September 13th, 1475 in Rome. He grew up in the shadow of the Vatican. Cesare, as we stated, was one of 4 siblings, including his purportedly very hot sister Lucrezia and his brother Juan. From a young age, Cesare showed remarkable intelligence and charisma, traits that would define his personal merits. Now, an int charisma build seems like a waste of ability scores at first, but when we look at his whole sheet, we can see that he really just rolled high. His early life was marked by duty and preparation for power. At just 15, he was made the Bishop of Pamplona, and by 18, he became a cardinal, positions arranged by his father's influence. Now, by today's standards, this might seem very strange, right? In fact, in my last video, we went over the decade of study it takes to become a priest in our modern times, but in Renaissance Italy, the situation was very different. The great families of Italy prized blood and loyalty overall, and every great family in Italy made sure they had their very own cardinals in order to lobby the Holy Father and possibly replace him when the time came. For these families, the necessary years of seminary preparation were accelerated in order to secure a seat in the Curia. But Cesare wasn't content with a religious career. He understood that he could be much more useful to his father in secular or worldly matters. He had a talent for military and political strategy, and as a man of the cloth, he was severely restricted. Now, he had a brother, Juan, and a much, much younger brother who never really did anything as not important. But Cesare was the second born, which is why he was put into the priesthood, a man of the cloth, to succeed his father, Rodrigo Borgia. Oh yeah, did I mention that? I think I did, yeah, basically, to roll this back a little bit, Rodrigo Borgia, the Pope Alexander, Cesare is his son, but in polite society and all this stuff, he's the nephew, right? So Rodrigo's thinking, my firstborn Juan will be the gonfaloniere of the papal armies, which is like the leader of the armies, like the general. He'll be the military man. And Cesare will be my clerical successor, right? The problem was Cesare got all the good genes. He was brilliant, he was strong, he was charismatic, and Juan was kind of a shitter. He didn't really do much. He was constantly drinking and whoring and doing all this stuff. And Cesare was just like maulding. He was absolutely maulding that his older brother was getting all the praise and messing it up. And he was a cool Chad that played strategy games all day in his room and ate chicken tendies. And his dad wanted him to be a priest when it was him who had all the potential. So, in 1498, he resigned his cardinalate, the first in history to do so, voluntarily, setting the stage for his transformation into a warrior prince. Cesare's rise began in earnest when his father became pope in 1492. Before this, he was a cardinal. I keep calling him pope, but he was a cardinal before this. He was actually I think he was the viceroy of the treasury, which is kind of like the vice president of Rome, of the papacy, or the vice chancellor. It's kind of like your top guy, the number 2 guy, the right-hand man of the pope. It was a very powerful position. Now, his brother Juan was mysteriously murdered in 1497. This is widely suspected to involve Cesare. It's never been proven. Some people say it's just slander by the Orsini and the Della Rovere, the other great families of Rome that hated the Borgias. It's very unclear. However, this did clear the path for him to assume military command. In 1499, Cesare married Charlotte d'Albret, the sister of the King of Navarre, securing a French alliance. This is a picture of Navarre here. You can see them there in the green. It's a small country kind of sandwiched between the 2 Spanish nations, France, and parts of France occupied by England at this time. This is a map in 1400, but the borders are basically the same in 1499. Now, this marriage was a political masterstroke, really, giving him the title of the Duke of Valentinois from King Louis of France. Cesare had a pretty good personal relationship with King Louis. They were friends. They played tennis together, or sort of the precursor of tennis, which is kind of like racquetball. They got along great. They were friends, and King Louis lent him his armies on several occasions. Italy had been invaded by both France and Austria and Spain a bunch of times, and it was always easy to take Italy, but very hard to hold it, which goes back to Machiavelli's saying, right? A decentralized state is easier to invade, but harder to hold, because you have the discontent nobility that will invite you in, but then there'll be a problem for you. Whereas a more centralized state like the Ottoman Empire is harder to take, but much easier to hold. And it's for these regions that Renaissance Italy was such a disaster of trying to rule. But people kept invading it because the provinces in the north especially were so rich with all those textiles and minerals and production, all that good stuff around the Milan kind of Venice, Florence region, right? Cesare's personal merits, his charm and his diplomatic savvy really helped to forge these ties with France, turning a lot of potential rivals into allies. Politically, Cesare exploited his father's position to amass titles and lands. He became Gonfaloniere and captain general of the church, the commander of the papal armies. And his victories really started with suppressing rebellious nobles in the papal states, demonstrating his ruthless efficiency. One early political win was the conquest of Imola and Forlì in 1499, where Cesare outmaneuvered Caterina Sforza, the so-called Tigress of Forlì. His ability to blend diplomacy with force highlighted his merits as a leader who could inspire loyalty while at the same time inspiring fear in those same men. Cesare's military prowess was pretty legendary. As a condottiero, or a mercenary captain, he led campaigns to reclaim and expand the papal states and created the Duchy of the Romagna. Now to go over this real quick, at this time, Cesare was basically the top general of the papal states. However, he also was a mercenary lord and would fight for various other city-states in Italy as a mercenary commander, all under the pretext of enriching and empowering the papal states, which his father was leading. And he used this combination of kind of an official force and unofficial force to really mold the Romagna into a proper country. Now, before the coming of the Borgias, the Romagna was these 17 minor lords overseeing basically just agricultural farming and a bit of production, and there's one port. And it was very loosely aligned. It was basically just lands held de jure, not a whole lot going on. They would constantly fight each other. Little bits would constantly get eaten up by Florence and Mantua and Naples, and it would constantly be in flux, right? But Cesare took control of the Romagna, and he forged it into a proper nation, a proper vassal state of the papal states. And thus he became the first Duke of the Romagna, for that title was created now that it had the power, the prestige, and the ability to stand as an actual duchy under the vassalship of the Holy Father. Now, in 1500, Cesare captured Imola, Forlì, and Cesena with pretty innovative tactics using artillery and surprise assaults, feints, envelopments. He defeated, once again, Caterina Sforza, Forlì, earning the nickname El Valentino and solidifying papal control. Now, the nickname El Valentino comes from being the former bishop of Valentinois. That was his role, because you have to be a bishop to become a cardinal. So when he was 18, he's the former bishop of Valentinois, and it's just kind of a cheeky nickname of that. This dude used to be a cardinal, and cardinals wear red because they're ready to shed their life's blood in defense of the church, but he was shedding real blood, and it was just kind of a funny nickname, right? Now, the thing about cannons is more of a big deal than it sounds like on the innovation fronts, right? You see, at this time in Italy, artillery, cannons, black powder were not widely used. They were considered barbaric or unsophisticated. I know that sounds really stupid, but the Italians considered themselves the heirs of the Roman Empire and thus greatly valued elegance in warfare. Now, this is, of course, pretty ironic considering the relative backwater status of Italy during this period as a military power. Cesare was always about being proactive, not reactive, and this is a tendency that would really define his approach. He started using cannons en masse as a battery to batter down those walls, and the first time he really did this was at the siege of Forlì, and this very quickly caught on with most military innovations too. Once someone starts doing it, everybody has to adopt them pretty quickly or just be left behind, right? In 1501, he conquered Faenza and Pompento. After a grueling siege at Faenza, Cesare's persistence won the day, adding his city to the domains. He then took Piombino, a very strategic port city, which enhanced his naval power and allowed the Romagna to start trading with the Venetians and the Turks and the greater Mediterranean trade. In 1503, he took Urbino and Carmina. It was really a bold move, Cesare seizing Urbino from Guidobaldo del Monfeltro, the leader of that free city, in a surprise attack, showcasing his strategic brilliance. Now, each of these cities I'm talking about, Faenza, Piombino, Urbino, Camerino, These are these little city-states in the center of Italy that are free states, right? They might have an allegiance on paper to like Florence or Milan or somewhere, but they're self-governing republics for the most part. Or they might have an alderman that rules them. But Cesare takes the papal lands, he takes the Romagna, and he takes all these little city-states between Rome and Florence and Naples and forges them all into one big duchy and really puts them to working together. Now, Cesare's armies were very disciplined and loyal, thanks to his leadership merits. He rewarded success and harshly punished disloyalty ruthlessly. He employed a lot of Swiss mercenaries as well, and of course the advanced siege techniques such as cannons made him nearly unstoppable, conquering a third of Italy in just 3 years. The entire center of Italy basically was conquered and run by Cesare Borgia during this period. And politically, Cesare was a master manipulator. He used his father's papal influence to forge alliances and eliminate his rivals. Now, his marriage and military support for King Louis secured French backing, allowing him to crush his Italian rivals like the Orsini family in 1502 and 1503. Cesare orchestrated the Magione conspiracy trap, where he, of course, feigned reconciliation to a bunch of feuding nobles before arresting and executing them on the spot. Kind of like the famous example of the female pharaoh Nefertiti's revenge on her brother's killer, where she invited them all to a banquet down by the Nile, and then when they all showed up, she had her guards drown them. It was very similar, but with poisoning instead. Very Italian spin on the old tale, right? Now, this French alliance was big for Cesare. France and Austria both wanted to control Italy and were constantly using the Italian states as their cat's paws in this endeavor. Cesare was given de facto command of the French army, and he used it very sparingly to purge those in rival families that opposed Rome and to cow others into compliance through the threat of its use. By 1501, Cesare was officially appointed the Duke of Romagna, unifying fragmented papal territories into a coherent state. He implemented reforms, built roads, courts, and fortifications, and the people really loved him for it because, for the first time in living memory, there was a unified, strong leader, and there weren't just bandits everywhere, causing chaos, stealing stuff. There were laws, there was roads, there was law and order, and that meant a lot to the common people. Like Machiavelli says, to be secure in your property rights is probably the biggest thing. Now, Cesare's duplicity really shone in dealing with the Orsini and the Colonna families, using poison, arrests, executions to really neutralize them. I spoke about this a bit earlier, but the Orsini and the Colonna families are old Italian families that really despised the Borgia and saw them as Spanish upstarts and fought them tooth and nail pretty much everywhere across Italy. And Cesare crushed them, finally, after about 20 years of a classic Italian feud. Now, reading this and listening to this, you may be thinking, well, Cesare sounds like a cool guy. He seems pretty goated, in my opinion, right? But a lot of this is built off of borrowed power. His father is the Pope, and the papal state is kind of backing all these ventures. And that's true. That's very true. Cesare kind of leveraged his borrowed power from the Pope to build his own duchy, secure his own thing. But eventually, the Pope has to die, right? And a new Pope will be elected, and it'll kind of reset the board. But Cesare knew this. His father, Rodrigo, they knew this. So they had carefully groomed a successor to the throne of St. Peter to sort of continue the administration, and it was all set. So in 1503, Pope Alexander died, and Cesare lost papal support. Now, Cesare and Alexander had planned for this meticulously, and they carefully ensured the election of a cardinal who was loyal to the Borgias as the next pope. With Cesare, of course, overseeing the Curia, this went according to plan, and the new pope supported the Duchy of Romagna just like Alexander before him. He was part of the program, so to speak. However, pure ill fortune intervened when Cesare's puppet pope suddenly took ill and died. The new pope, Julius II, was an enemy of the Borgia. He was from the della Rovere family, another Italian family that just hated the Borgias. Julius II stripped Cesare of all his titles and rallied most of Italy against him through the threat of excommunication. Cesare had made the Romagna a powerful state through his leadership, but in the face of imminent invasion and excommunication, it stood no chance. He was imprisoned in Rome for a while, for a number of months under Julius's orders, until he was extradited to Spain on order from the King of Aragon, who also held grievances against Cesare for allying with Spain. Cesare spent several months in prison until he made a daring escape and headed to Navarre. Now, I've spoken about Navarre briefly. It was a small Spanish nation on the border between France and Spain. Cesare was in fact married to the sister of the King of Navarre, making him his brother-in-law. He was welcomed with open arms and made captain general of the Navarrese army. In this capacity, he won multiple upsetting victories for the Navarrese crown against Castile, Aragon, Spain, and even some skirmishes with English bandits on the border. His tragic end finally came when, during a nighttime battle, he was separated from the rest of his cavalry element. He was surrounded by the enemy and killed. In the darkness, they did not know who he was, or else he would have undoubtedly been captured and ransomed back to the Navarrese crown. He was 31 years old when he died. Now that's about it for the story of Cesare. If you like this kind of history, this Borgia stuff, there's a great show called The Borgias on Showtime. And there's a really trashy, terrible show called The Borgias from HBO. Watch the Showtime one, not the cringe HBO one. Just letting you know, But yeah, I've always found Cesare Borgia to be extremely interesting. It's like Machiavelli says in The Prince. He really is kind of the embodiment of these Renaissance prince virtues. He chooses to be feared rather than loved, but he prioritizes property rights, and his people that he governed really respected him for that. He was ruthless and used duplicity when necessary, but not over so much. He got his tyranny kind of out of the system early in these reigns, and he accomplished a lot with almost nothing, with only the support from the Pope, who couldn't really do anything in practice but had a lot of power on paper, and a really interesting dynamic figure. So that's pretty much it for the video. If you like this, if you enjoyed it, consider subscribing. Check out some of my other videos. I actually did a big video on Machiavelli's The Prince, the famous strategy book. So check that out if you like this kind of stuff, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.